We've been talking about Paleo-Indians. Now we're going to talk about the Archaic Period. Now, again, these dates are sort of malleable, sort of adjustable, sort of general. But roughly speaking, the Archaic Period, particularly east of the Mississippi, was from about 8,000 BCE, before the Common Era, to about 1,000 BCE, so roughly about 7,000 years. The 8,000 BC approximate date is because that was around the time that Altithermal period began, when things started getting warmer, a few degrees warmer, and more ice started to melt, which caused a lot of runoff that led to the creation of new lakes and rivers, but which eventually led to a drier, more arid climate in the west particularly. And when that happened, then a lot of the animals who were living on the plains migrated away, literally in search of greener pastures. And when that happened, when there were fewer animals to hunt and eat, the people who were living on the plains followed them and left the area as well. Everybody didn't leave, but there were significantly fewer people in the area than there previously had been. Near the end of that period, about 2000 BCE, things started to cool down a little bit again, and the climate once more became more moderate, which meant that there was more grass growing in the plains area, and a lot of those animal groups started to come back, and when they did, human groups started to come back as well. So the population started to increase near the end of the Archaic Period, and with more people in the area, that led to the establishment of trade networks and some warfare, as different bands struggled with one another for control of the resources that were there. Now, the end period of the Archaic Era is much more on a sliding scale than the beginning period. And that's because we're really not talking about a specific set of dates when we're talking about the Archaic Period. We're talking about a specific set of cultural circumstances. Essentially, the Archaic Period ended when the groups, the bands in a region, adopted sedentary farming, started staying permanently in one place and raising crops. Then they moved on to the next period that we'll talk about later. So in some areas, in some regions, that happened sooner or later than in others. So in some areas, the end of the Archaic Period might have been 1,000 years earlier than 1000 BCE. And there were a handful of cultures that essentially were still in their Archaic Period when Europeans first arrived. Not very many, but a handful of isolated groups. Well, the bands during the Archaic Period continued to be nomadic, just as during the Paleo-Indian period. But their traveling became more limited. They sort of wandered nomadically, but with a purpose, in smaller circuits or circles. And as more plants were growing and becoming abundant again, then if you're in one of these bands of 20 or 30 people, you might notice in your wanderings, your group might notice that there are certain places you wandered through that have good things to eat growing there. Maybe let's say some fruit trees, or maybe edible plants. And they're there in abundance at a certain time of year. Well, those groups started to adjust their traveling schedule so they would be back at that area the same time the next year to take advantage of that. And as they discovered more and more areas that either had plentiful game or lots of edible plant life, nuts and berries, or like I say, some edible plants or roots, then their stops along the way became fewer. And in one of those areas where resources were abundant, instead of, as the Paleo Indians had, staying in that place for 5 or 6 days, they might stay there for 5 or 6 weeks. And then eventually they might stay there for 5 or 6 months. And then eventually, this plant life that they were eating and checking up on, coming back through at a certain time to see if it was ripe yet or whatever, they started being intentional and planting things, transplanting things, making adjustments so as to achieve a desired change or result. And that was what led to agriculture, farming, and eventually to, at first, staying in a handful of places, each one for a finite amount of time, and then sort of moving around in a small circle, but then eventually kind of staying in the same place. And as that started happening, then also these bands started adopting specific locations or sites for their rituals. Previously, if they had certain rituals to perform that sort of required being up on a very high place, why they would look in their travels for a high place and then go stop there and do their rituals. But now that they're traveling in much smaller circles and eventually traveling less, they would have these sites picked out permanently. So, this spot is where we go to do such and such a ritual or a festival. Also, burial rituals became more elaborate, a lot more involved. And there's some evidence that people were beginning to think that after someone died, that perhaps a part of them lived on not just in some other world, but in this world, and could perhaps help you out in things, be your intercessor, or I guess if you didn't treat them right, haunt you. So those changes started to become evident because once there was enough plant life, once things became lush enough to sustain larger populations, then several bands would start to coalesce and come together and all stay in one place, and you had larger populations, and therefore you had more people working at hunting and harvesting and so forth, which gave you a little more time during the day to think about better ways to do things, or to think about art, or to think about religion, spirituality. And so those things started to become more complex. So at the time that this several thousand year period, that this was the situation, that this was the case, the world was changing, literally, generation by generation, around the inhabitants of North America. And, if you say starting at 8,000 BCE, or 10,000 years ago, there had been all this megafauna, great big huge giant sloths and saber-toothed tigers, and still some glacial cover up in the mountains. And then things start to change so that after a few generations, some of those animals don't exist anymore, but stories about them still do. Or in some cases, perhaps sometimes fossilized bones might be found. And then as things warm up and a lot of that ice starts melting, the landscape is transformed. There are, like I said, new lakes, new rivers. So in some ways, at a certain point, after 4,000 or 5,000 years, you had people who were living in, like I said, a totally different landscape than perhaps the stories that had been passed down from their ancestors described. And maybe this is where some of the folklore and some of the stories came from. This is true of indigenous people in North America, but it's also true of people at about this point of development all around the world. Cultural memory. So many different tribes around North America have, for example, stories of the stone people. That is, people from a long time ago who were bigger than regular people and who were made of stone or who clothed themselves, wore stone. Really, really thick hides that it was difficult to pierce with weapons, and some of these stone people would eat regular people. So maybe this was a cultural memory of some of those megafauna beasts, which would seem fantastical, 1,000 years after they had stopped existing. And maybe as well, stories about different worlds that had come before might be a cultural memory of the transitioning and changing of the landscape. Almost all, well, maybe I should, okay, I'm going to say almost all, most cultures in North America have, as part of their creation story, the idea that the whole world was covered in water, and that very gradually something happened that caused land to reappear. And of course, those same stories appear all around the world and are probably a cultural memory of that time, thousands of years ago, when things got warm real suddenly, and then all that ice melted and areas were flooded, and then very gradually the waters receded. So that may be some cultural holdovers. But regardless, it is true that by the end of the Archaic period, for most tribes, particularly east of the Mississippi and along the Mississippi River, by the end of it, they were living in a different world than their ancestors had lived in a few thousand years before. Now, some ideas that started to appear during the Archaic period involved interaction with the spirit world, with this other world. Maybe that's where dead people go. Maybe they still exist on this other side. Maybe that's where some of the creatures of myth and legend, which in some cases grew into deities, existed. So some of those areas that people would use for their rituals would tie in to those types of rituals. Now, ritual is essentially when you act something out that has happened in the past to acknowledge it, or you act something out with the belief that sort of reenacting it on a small scale will cause it to come true on a large scale. For example, a lot of cultures around the world, hunting rituals involve the people participating in them pretending, miming, mimicking, being on a successful hunt, hoping that will then kind of shift the cosmic balance in their favor and they'll really have a successful hunt. So some of the things that people started paying attention to were high places, which I mentioned earlier, cliffs, and also on the opposite end of the spectrum, things like caves and sinkholes and springs where the water is bubbling up from under the ground. There was this belief eventually that developed, and again, this is not unique to the inhabitants of the Americas, that there are three worlds. There is this world on which we live, which could be called the middle world, or in Europe, in Germanic tradition, Midgard, right? It's the middle. And then the upper world and the lower world. So Rituals in which you wanted to contact or influence the spirits of the upper world most often were conducted in a high place so you could be closer to those spirits. Rituals in which you were trying to contact or influence denizens of the lower world, then you go down into the earth, into caves and things like that. So this is why you find a lot of cave art, and some of it is deep down in those caves. There also had been art painted on the sides of cliffs that probably, for the most part, has not stood the test of thousands of years, as well as the stuff that was on those rock walls deep down in the earth, undisturbed by the elements or other people. So the upper world, the middle world, the lower world, that's 3 worlds. So in a lot of cultures, 3 is therefore a special, spiritually significant number. And there are 4 directions, sometimes called the 4 winds. 4 directions the wind can come from. So 4 can also be a significant number. And when you take the 3 and the 4 and add them together, you get 7. 7 is a significant number for that reason among many tribes. Like, just for example, back east of the Mississippi, the Cherokee, they still have traditionally 7 clans. And their council lodges would have 7 poles. And so it would create, I guess you would call it a septagram. So all of those things started to develop, those ideas started to develop during the Archaic period.